Hey, I'm Adrian. Thanks for joining us for Shifting the Future of Business and Design. Today's talk, it is a multidisciplinary one, spanning business, design, and culture. And we'll be exploring current trends while also pointing out where greater change can be made. We have a stacked panel of 3 experts for you today. We'd like to welcome Alisha Bhagat, who has mastered creatively using future tools to impact long-term positive change, particularly around social justice and equality. And that is a pretty hot topic. Welcome in, Alisha.
So I'll get started. I am a futurist, and I'm really happy to be here today. I'm extra interested in long-term trends and how that they might impact our decision-making, particularly in the world that we live in today with so much uncertainty. So I mostly work with companies, and I'm finding that companies need to pivot even faster, consider multiple scenarios, and plan for what in the past used to be considered highly improbable. Today, I'm going to talk to you about who we envision and create the future for, and how we might rethink the way that we design for the future. So I'll start by sharing a few images of the future that I love. So here's the first one, and kind of thinking about the future, and many of us kind of go to this sort of techno future, as well as thinking about a very dystopian science fiction future. And you know, our current obsession with the dystopian fiction and these type of future scenarios is really interesting, because it actually means we're thinking about the future all the time. It's in the media we consume. It's often very anxiety provoking to think about the future. And it's really fascinating to us, because what we do when we create these dystopian fictions is we have a really easy way to understand a bad scenario. So you can just look at the picture. I don't even have to tell you the movie, and you can kind of figure out, like, okay, water is scarce. There's like some weird technology going on. And in this particular case of Blade Runner, there's human clones. So we use that space to then test our ideas and think about how potential changes, social and technological, may impact the world around us. So what products might we design in the world of Watchmen, for example? The future serves as a place where we can create, imagine, and dream up solutions that then we can employ in the present. However, it's hard to think constructively about the future, moving past all of this doom and gloom, to create positive visions that are inclusive, equitable, and actually work for everyone. So let's go back to that first image, the dominant image kind of the techno future. Unfortunately, we get stuck in this narrative a lot that there's going to be some sort of tech utopia that will save us, especially kind of in the startup space. And this future portrayed by companies and media shows kind of a high-tech Silicon Valley world. Tech is the solution to all of our problems. And it's usually, as you see in this image, inhabited by kind of a young, able-bodied, cis-gendered white person. And I can, you know, we all have images of what this might be like with Internet of Things and virtual worlds, algorithms. Like, that's sort of kind of where we go when we think about the future and how it impacts our world. But I wanted to note that this is kind of just one vision of the future. So if this year has taught us anything, it's that the changes and challenges we're facing are not just tech related. And the biggest things that shaped our world, COVID, racial justice protesting, climate change, and fires, are actually due to a number of factors, systemic level inadequacies, and ultimately the future is and will be about people and how we think and act together. And to kind of hit that home, I wanted to share some more images of the future that I consider quite futuristic. And they're all speculative futures depending on your viewpoint. So in 1960, this was considered speculative, like this was not a reality. So interracial, dining lunch counter, definitely a work of fiction. We've been seeing kind of this summer of statues being torn down and investigation of how we memorialize people and what monuments we have. This was something totally speculative that we couldn't have anticipated maybe a year ago. And gay marriage was once a fiction. That was in our lifetime, at least my lifetime, that people didn't think that that was going to become a reality. We needed to kind of collectively think it was possible to then work towards and design solutions towards it. And sort of the problems of our time, such as homelessness, are not defaults or givens. We can envision a future kind of without these problems, and then design products and services to make that future a reality. So a lot of the big problems that we face today need these systemic solutions that move past just simply technological fixes. And it's up to all of us as companies and individuals and citizens to create preferred, probable, and possible futures, then work together to get there. So if we can't imagine or envision aspects of the future, such as a world without homelessness, we're not going to get there because we can't design for it. So it's really important to consider who you're creating the future for, the unintended consequences of what you're creating, and the potential for long-term change. If you're investing in startups or businesses, you're inherently a futurist, as you're trying to see and believe in a vision of the world that's inherently different than the world that we currently have in our current reality. And it's really important also to draw the link between the way we see the future and design for the present. So we currently live in a reality created by people who came before us. So everything from the built infrastructure of like highways, single gender bathrooms, to products and policies were created in anticipation of future needs. And so these carry values and assumptions of people from the past. So one of the examples I like is around food, and the way that people from the past conceived of what food of the future, food products of the future would need to be, indicates kind of the values that they held. So in classic TV show Star Trek, this came through a replicator that kind of was extremely convenient, no cleanup, but also no labor visible, no food sourcing visible. If you see this as kind of the dominant future of what we should go towards and who should be involved in the future, then kind of what are you kind of creating for that? And so we end up with products that reflect that and those values. So TV dinners, for example, are sort of the epitome of the future when they came out, as they were designed around this piece of tech. Very convenient, meant to be consumed at home, no labor, no cleanup, and kind of a detachment from the agricultural process. And when we look at modern food products that are being kind of put forward, such as the Impossible Whopper, we still value convenience, but we want health and sustainability as well. So it has those aspects baked in, but the kind of values and worldview that shaped the design of things like the TV dinner kind of carry over to the creation and design of the Impossible Whopper. Another example that I'll share comes from a really famous book called Future Shock, written in 1970. And in there's a description of a Wall Street executive who works in New York and commutes home on the weekend to Columbus, Ohio. And it's seen as like this amazing innovation of the technological age that he could just hop on a jet, be home in like an hour and a half to his wife and children. But it ignores kind of the core questions around who the future's for and if these futures are desirable that we're kind of designing for. So very little thought is given to his wife and child. Is this the future that they want? Is it good for cities to have a large number of commuters like this? And as many people might be living that reality of commuting from one city to another, is it actually desirable to fly home every weekend? So disruptions like COVID have actually caused us to rethink how we might design for the future and who we want to involve in that process of design. So one great example that we're seeing today is around the open streets in New York City. So people are rethinking what we might use the streets for, if not vehicular traffic. Could we use it for dining? Could we use it for play? What might the city look like if we're not, using them for traffic anymore? And the pathways and systems that we're currently designing kind of reflect the designers, and their implications are long-term. So if this works out, who knows, we might have a very different city than what we see today. We have an opportunity to rethink who the future is actually for, and to make sure we're designing in a way that's inclusive and enables long-term growth. So I'll leave you with a few questions to consider as you're making those decisions. So first, who has the skills to build for the people who are left out? Second, what does it actually mean to meet those needs of people? And finally, how can we create a long-lasting vision of the future that works for all? Thank you.
We also have Kaya Thomas, Senior iOS Engineer at Calm. And Kaya, she's got a strong command of building inclusive products. Take it away, Kaya.
Hello, I'm so excited to be with you today to chat about accessible and inclusive development. So first off, I want to discuss really what is accessibility. And accessibility is focused on the process of creating products, technology, software that is usable by all people, regardless of their ability. And when I'm talking about ability, I'm really talking about differing abilities and the different ways people experience life. 15% of the world's population lives with some form of disability, according to the World Health Organization. And in the United States, the CDC says about a quarter of the American population lives with a disability. So if you're building products or services in which you're not making sure that they're accessible, you're leaving out and alienating a large population of the world and of the country. So when you build products and services, it's incredibly important that you think about folks who experience life differently from yourself if you don't live with a disability. Now that we covered a bit about accessibility, I really want to get into inclusion, because a lot of times folks don't understand that there's a huge difference between accessibility and inclusion. Accessibility is the first step, but inclusion is really about welcoming someone in and making sure that they have a great experience. I love this quote and definition from education researcher Diane Sidoric. Inclusion implies being included. To include means to consider as a part of a whole. Thus, inclusion means to participate in and be a part of. So this is really where the welcoming comes in. When you're building inclusive products and services, you're going beyond the first step of just making it usable, but you're actually bringing them in to show that you're being intentional to make their experience just as good, regardless of what their ability is. I like to use this example of a gym. Now, let's say a gym owner wants to make their gym accessible. So to do so, they make a ramp so that wheelchair users can come into the gym. Now, this may now be an accessible gym, but it's not an inclusive gym. They haven't changed anything about the actual experience of being and using the gym. They haven't updated the equipment so that it's easier for folks of different abilities to use. They haven't changed their class offerings to see if they can have more inclusive instructors or different class types. They only added a ramp. Now, the ramp is a great step, but it's not actually making the experience inclusive. So how does this apply to software? In the same vein of having a wheelchair ramp to allow someone in the gym, if you just make your software accessible with the first step, meaning that someone who has a different life experience, let's say they use a screen reader and they're blind, they can use that screen reader to interact with your software, but they have immense difficulty actually getting what you intend for your users to experience with your product from your product because it's just not inclusive. So if you're not actually being intentional when you're trying to build for accessibility, you're really alienating folks, and you're not being intentional about making a better experience for all of your users, no matter how they experience life. And so inclusion is really about making the intentional effort versus just taking the first step with accessibility. So Haben Girma is an incredible disability advocate. She is the first deaf-blind graduate from Harvard Law School. And this quote from her is just immensely inspiring to me. All the barriers that exist are created by society. We play a role in removing those barriers and making sure that everyone can access information and opportunities. I met Haben Girma about 4 years ago, and it was immensely incredible to communicate with her. And the way that you communicate with her is through technology. So you type into a keyboard, which then translates what you typed into Braille for her to then read. And then she'll speak back to you. And that's how you have a conversation with her. Now, if the technology wasn't created for her to be able to communicate, her intellect, her ideas, her incredible insights would not be able to be in the world. All of that she's contributed to this world is because she's been able to use technology to live her life and to be able to share her insights and make a huge impact in the disability space. So this is one of the reasons why technology can remove those barriers. And so if you're creating products and services, but you're not being intentional to remove those barriers, you're a part of the problem and you are creating barriers. So that's why it's important to make sure that you're building accessible and inclusive products so that you can be a part of removing the barriers so that everyone can then benefit from the services that you're trying to offer. So in thinking about making your software and products more accessible, I want to really go over some concrete ways that you can do so. First, you're going to want to understand the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and as well as ADA, the American Disability Act compliance. So the Web Content and Accessibility Guidelines give you a great understanding of, if you're building web software, what you need to do to make sure that your website is usable and accessible. And the reason the ADA is important is, even if you're a small business, if you potentially want to work with larger companies, most larger companies are really intentional about being ADA compliant, because if they're not ADA compliant, users and customers can actually file a lawsuit against, most of the time, these larger companies. And so if you intend to have partnerships or you want to work with larger companies, then you should really make sure that you're following the ADA guidelines and your web content abides by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And if you're kind of confused about how you can actually understand and test if your website or app is abiding by these guidelines, you should do a manual audit of your website with a screen reader tool and other accessibility tools. So a screen reader like VoiceOver on the iPhone allows blind folks who can't actually see the screen, allows them to interact with the technology through reading aloud what is on the screen to them. And usually, like on the iPhone, they'll swipe or have some type of other interactions to navigate through the screen. So if you do an audit of your website or app with a screen reader tool, you'll get a good understanding of if your software is actually compliant and if it's even usable in the first place. Another thing that's really important is checking the color contrast of the designs on your website and in your app. So a lot of times, we love having fun designs with tons of colors and things, but if you're stacking two colors on top of each other that don't have a good contrast, if a user is colorblind, they're not going to actually be able to differentiate between the colors that are on the screen. So you should use a color contrast tool to check the colors that you're trying to pair together to ensure that if a user or customer is colorblind, they would still be able to differentiate between the two elements on the screen that you're trying to pair on top of each other. Another thing that also oftentimes get missed, but I think is really important in the conversation about accessibility, is QAing your products in low connectivity states. A lot of us are privileged to have great internet connection and live in places in which we have really great Wi-Fi access. But another part of accessibility, like I said, is really trying to understand and make sure that your product and services are available to folks who have different life experiences than yourself. So not everywhere in the world is going to have great internet connectivity or Wi-Fi access. So ensuring that your software and products are also available over a cellular network or a lower connectivity state is going to be really important. So making sure that your products and services are still performant in those states. So those are the things that you can do to make sure that you're doing that first step of making your software or products more accessible. But being intentional about making it inclusive and making it a great experience is going to take a bit more effort. First, I really think it's important to bake conversations of accessibility and inclusion throughout your product process. So this means when you're talking about feature development and you're building your user stories, you really want to make sure that you're capturing all sorts of customers. So not just one customer type or segment. So think about how this feature can really affect the life experience of someone who is very different from yourself or very different than your team. Another way is if you're a larger company especially, you can run usability and focus groups with customers of varying abilities and backgrounds. Apple does this with their beta software. They have groups of folks who are in the disability community, and they give the beta software to them to ensure that the experience is great, and they can get feedback and then incorporate that feedback. And there are also companies like user testing, in which if you can't actually run the accessibility or focus groups yourself, you can find folks and use user testing to give them your software and then allow them to give you feedback. There's also third-party audits with professional accessibility consultants. Accessibl.com is a great one, and they'll help you. They even have monthly subscriptions in which they can ensure that your website and software is ADA compliant and WCAG compliant. And lastly, automation. As an engineer myself, automating processes makes things much easier sometimes because human beings often forget. So if you can put some automation in your QA process to ensure that your accessibility elements and content are not regressing, that's going to be incredibly important to making sure that you have a consistent and high quality bar experience for the users who depend on accessibility. Here are some questions I think are important to ask in the product process when you're developing new features or working on new products and services in your company. What are ways we can improve this feature for folks who experience it differently from ourselves? Could this new feature potentially alienate a subset of our customers? How can we ensure that accessibility is a requirement and blocker for launch? I want to talk a little bit about this question because it can seem a little bit controversial, especially if you're a startup and let's say you're trying to move fast, you're working on getting funding, and you feel like you just have to ship, and you don't have time to think about accessibility or block a feature for launch. I really want you to take a step back and really think about what you're trying to do and who you're trying to reach. If you just focus on shipping fast and don't think about accessibility in your product process, remember that you're alienating and losing a large subset of potential customers. How can we automate a part of this process to ensure it's not forgotten and it's always baked into the process? So ending and thinking about that automation to see if you can make sure that the human element of forgetfulness sometimes is taken out of the equation by ensuring that your accessibility QA process is something that is always done when you're launching and releasing your software. So I want to leave you with remembering that accessibility is the first step, not the last. So it's incredibly important for you to bake in that accessibility, but don't forget to be intentional with making inclusive experiences. And lastly, I just want to share some resources with you all that I think would be great if you're interested in learning more and continuing on this journey of understanding accessibility and inclusion. First is Disability and Innovation, which was a talk given by Haben Girma at Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference in 2016. Next is a new book that was recently published by editor Alice Wong called Disability Visibility. Next is Heben's memoir, The Deafblind Woman Who Conquered Harvard Law. And lastly, Apple's accessibility documentations and guidelines. I think especially if you're in the mobile app space and an iOS developer like myself, it's incredibly important to go and look what's already available, because luckily Apple bakes in a lot of accessibility and makes it really easy to understand as engineers on how we can make our apps more accessible. Thank you so much.
This social investor, well, he's got some big intel. That's Leif Abraham. He joins us from Public, where he's the co-CEO. Now, Public is a company that accelerates all people's prosperity by making the stock market inclusive, educational, and fun. It's all you, Leif.
Hey, what's up? My name is Leif. I'm the co-CEO of Public.com. And so first, thanks for having me in this virtual, always semi-awkward setting. And so I'm just going to dive in. I'm going to tell you a little bit about today, something that we're just focused on within Public, which we believe is, fairly important to kind of build people's financial literacy and also help them to kind of get started in the stock market as well. Here we go. And so super quick, just like general background on Public.com. And so we are what we call the investing social network. And so on Public, right, you can basically learn from other people's experiences. You can see what other people are investing in. You have this like trusted community. In that case, on Public, because it's also an investing app, it's really that anyone who's part of that network actually went through full identity verification because they actually have a brokerage account. And so we kind of often joke that we are the most verified social network in the history of social networks. And therefore, like the quality of the experience obviously kind of just levels up itself automatically from that. And then, you can basically trade instant fractional shares. So you can invest in companies with any amount of money. And so this is how the app kind of looks like, just for you as a background. Right, so you basically open up the app on this, kind of feed of the stock market. And so we often say that, we kind of package the stock market up in a form factor that people are used to, and kind of have this content bubble up in this format that people understand, which is basically social content. It's your portfolio. You can invest in any company with any amount of money. So despite Amazon maybe being $3,000 a share now, you can invest in Amazon, which is $25. And then obviously you can, follow other investors on the app. You can check out certain themes like our version of a Spotify playlist. You can join chat groups. And obviously anyone on the app has what we call a public portfolio. So you can see what are the companies that people believe in, what are the, stocks they own, and what is like the insight that they've shared basically around these investments in the community. One big thing that really has happened specifically in the last 6 months roughly is that trading volume in the US has, or like the trading volume of like retail investors, like, basically people that are not funds, has been growing about 100%. And so it went from like 10% of the market to about 20% of the market. And that is a drastic shift in basically all the dynamics around the stock market. I actually had a friend of mine text me this one morning where he was, kind of jokingly saying of like, I woke up this morning and the first thing my wife asked me about is what I think about Asana's IPO. What have you done? And so you really see it right now that more and more people are joining the stock market, and that, apps like Public make it just very easy to do so. And we believe that's obviously generally a net positive, but, obviously there are a lot of questions now popping up around, should people be actively investing in the stock market or not? And so that's basically what I'm going to talk about today, to kind of give you a feeling of, why we believe that is a good thing. So I personally didn't start actively investing in the stock market until I was like 30 years old or so. And every morning I kick myself in the butt that I didn't start earlier. And so hence this like very, fancy gift over here. And that is even despite, for example, that my father was investing in the stock market for, as long as I know him, right? And I had some exposure to it, even then I still didn't actually start to get, rolling until I was about 30 years old. We did a survey to a bunch of our users, and one big thing that came out is that about 20, a quarter of people fall into the same camp, and so they didn't start investing until after they basically hit the 30th birthday. And the other side of that kind of, what the issue here is that, about 55% of those people that we've asked from our user base basically said that they're self-taught. And only 18% said that they've learned this in school. And that is really also, again, one of these major issues kind of comes from, is that in most schools, you don't learn about investing, right? You don't learn about how you value companies, you don't learn about the stock market and so on. And that is really, something that, is honestly kind of bad. Because at the end of the day, this knowledge gap basically equals, in the end, also a general wealth gap that you're seeing there. And so about, only half of Americans are invested in the stock market, so far. And that even includes people that are invested through the 401k, all their pension and so on. And so, of this basic, upside that is there in the stock market, and again, the stock market has been growing, like on average, roughly 10% year over year, is that most people are kind of locked out of that gain, which is obviously a sad thing. And so generally, we believe getting more people invested in the stock market is a net positive. And it's not just a net positive in terms of, hey, you can build your wealth and, maybe make some money on the stock market, and that's obviously good and that's fine. But one big thing is really, it's what you've learned from being actively involved in the stock market is that it really builds your financial literacy. And that financial literacy is not just about building wealth, but it has a lot of kind of side effects to it as well. And one thing I personally always say is that, the stock market is a major piece of kind of like our modern society, right? And so if you're an adult member in that society, it's really that, knowing how the stock market works helps you also understand, incentives in politics and business and so on. And so there's a lot of side effects to it that are just very helpful to people if they understand how the stock market works and, learning, about that by being actively involved in it. The biggest issue though is really, this is how investing in the stock market looks like if you go into online communities. And so it's very heavily white male dominated, right? You have these Wolf of Wall Street memes. It's kind of close to gambling culture, right? People shouting on Twitter, the stock market only goes up, blah, 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 right? People picking some penny stocks and so on. And that is obviously something that is not necessarily very appealing to most people. And so the market seems scary because the culture around is scary. And that's, one of the major issues. And so one big thing that we are always saying is that in order to truly democratize the stock market, we have to change its culture. And so one thing that we've been, very mindful of as we started Public is that from the very beginning, to actively not acquire the typical trader bro, but to basically actively acquire people that might have, not been the target for stock investing apps before, that, might come out of, industries and so on that are, not necessarily very numbers driven, right? That's all about, for example, creatives and so on. And with that, to really create a community around the stock market that from the ground up is a way more diverse and inclusive community. And what's really happened on Public is that on Public now, about 40% of the user base is women. Still not equal, but it's still tremendously better than what you normally find out there if you're trying to, get involved in the stock market and like join certain communities online. One thing we often say is the sense of that if you're in Public, you're not just investing with your brain. You're not just coming from like, yes, I want to make some gains here now. What is that stock take that you have for me? But people also invest with their hearts. And I think the one big thing, around this is that if you're talking to people who are coming out of finance, they will come from a super rational sense. But most people are not purely rational, right? We are also led by our personal beliefs, by our personal values. We are led by what brands we think are cool, etc. And so on this, and that's kind of translates itself then also into how we might experience the stock market and our investing decisions. So if I'm super into basketball, I might want to buy Nike and Under Armour and, whatever the company is that owns Madison Square Garden and things like that. But on the other hand, also, it, for example, can lead to things like this. And so Casey here is, one of the members in the community. And so when the first kind of Black Lives Matter protests started to happen, she and some other Black women on the app started buying the 4 S&P 500 companies that are run by Black CEOs in order to also, shine a light on that there are only 4. And then it was, for example, something that just started to kind of go viral throughout the community and so on. And where you see that, investing is not just a matter of, who has the quickest gains and so on, but it's also a matter of what kind of personal values you are driven by, because at the end of the day, you're also voting with your dollars to a certain extent. And in a social setting, it's also about showing, what you believe in. And so that is 3 points that we always try to make. And so one is the sense of that you have to be able to see yourself in that community. And, as really, the community around the stock market has been this like kind of bro-y experience. It's also why it seemed why it seems so scary to most people, and why they didn't see themselves as part of their community and therefore didn't even get started. And on the other hand, it's, it should be much more about human exchanges than purely showing off. And so, it's not a competition, but it's something where it should be about you experiencing the stock market with other people together to either learn from their experiences because they might be more experienced than you, or to experience it with someone who's on the same level as you, because it's kind of like a gym buddy, right? It's not fun to go to the gym with someone who's just way more in shape than you. And so it even helps you to have people who are on the same level to experience the stock market together with them. And that kind of, brings down kind of like the barrier to get involved, and it helps to have someone to kind of spar with as you kind of experience the stock market. At the end of the day, it's also about just do you feel welcome? And so as again, back to what we've built within public, within the community, one thing we're pretty proud of is that if you come in as like a very new investor, someone who hasn't really invested much in the stock market yet or so, and you get started and you ask like something that might seem like a dumb question to someone who is a little bit more experienced, chances are that in our community you will actually get an answer. And so this sense of, as you get started, to actually feel welcome and to be able to see yourself and then have these actually human exchanges, they're not just about showing off, not just about gains and so on, really brings down the barrier of entry in the first place. And so we truly believe that basically, a large network with diversity of thought also just means that you have more opportunities to learn. And as you dive into the stock market, often the kind of insights you're also looking for are not just purely from people who understand financial statements and have, read the latest earnings report and break that down, but you also want to hear from people who understand certain trends. And so if you're interested in the future of fitness, you might want to talk to a Peloton instructor. And that is what's really interesting about, kind of opening the markets more up, building this community that's way more inclusive, that you're not just surrounded by the typical, finance people, but, by having this like larger network and therefore a way broader diversity of thought within that, it just opens also up way more opportunities to learn. And so when we talk about the democratization for this, of the stock market, often it's getting referred to as giving people access. And giving people access then means basically making all tools available to everyone. The thing though is that if you look around and you look at kind of the tools that are available, to experienced people in the stock market, then a lot of these might, should not be available maybe to everyone right away, because you need some extra education and you need some experience, before you really should play around with those other, types of trades you could basically make. And so we often say that democratization is not just about access, but it's about approachability. And that approachability is really driven on the one side by experiencing it with others and by experiencing it with people that are also the same level as you are, not just more advanced as you are. But the approachability comes also just purely from how the experience is designed in the first place. And because at the end of the day, it's that, for us, something like being the markets for new investors also comes with a responsibility to help protect them. And in the end of the day, right, you're using your money here. People's money is involved. And so with that, we believe it's very important to make sure that people, have access to certain information at certain times when we believe they should have it. To give an example, so back in May, or May 22nd to be exact, Hertz filed for bankruptcy. Hertz, the car rental company. And when they did that, and they basically went into these bankruptcy proceedings, their stock kept trading. And normally when that happens historically, right, the stock obviously starts to plummet and so on. The thing is, at that time, what actually happened was, yes, it plummeted at first, but then it suddenly started to pick up again. Even though the volume on that stock might have not been as high as it would normally be and so on. But a lot of kind of like retail investors suddenly picked it up. And they started trading the stock despite this company basically, just having filed for bankruptcy. So Hertz saw that. And so on June 12th, they were actually suddenly approved to sell up to $1 billion of newly printed stock. And they refer to it as, an unprecedented opportunity for them. And that opportunity obviously just meant to basically sell a security that has a high likelihood of being worthless to, a set of investors who might just not know what they're doing at this point, and who might not actually have the information that, or the experience or the, just education that that they should have had in order to actually engage with that company at that point in time. And so on the Sunday after that announcement, June 14, we actually took the step and halted the buying of Hertz stock. And so if you had it, you could still sell it, but we didn't basically let new people buy it. And we believe that it was an important step for us to kind of step in, because it was a very unprecedented scenario. Because how it looked like was basically that it became a game of who's going to hold the bag last. And that has nothing to do with investing anymore. That's a pure speculation on, basically who's going to get rid of it first. And so a few days after that, which was, I think, the following Wednesday on June 17, the SEC actually stepped in. And then that's when Hertz also abandoned the plans to sell that new stock. But for us at Public, that basically inspired kind of like a new series of features. And so the week after that, we launched what we call safety labels. And so safety labels is basically that certain stocks within, or certain securities within the platform basically, got this little tag, which are these security labels. And so companies that were labeled by the SEC for potentially being more risky, so specialized ETFs, bankrupt companies, companies with nano or micro caps, so like with a very low market cap, which are very small companies that might be more volatile. And so we started labeling these stocks. And so as you then were purchasing these stocks now, we give you this information kind of in that context. You have to slide to confirm to really kind of start investing in those companies. And so those are the types of moves that we just truly believe are important to build as you build something that is truly meant also for a lot of new investors who might have the first experience ever in the stock market on Public. The other part of it is really this concept of like community as a safety measure, right? And if you think about the community, what's very interesting is because we've really kind of built this from the ground up, we obviously, we're able to also shape it differently. And so what you see on Public is really people much more trying to educate each other. And so one trend that we've seen is this hashtag share your losses. And so where people actively share their losses to the feed, to kind of, show also other people that, it can have that it happens to them as well. And to also just share their learnings of, for example, someone might have invested in a company that they didn't do much research on, and they just, took a quick bet here and then it didn't turn out right. And they might, just share afterwards that, for example, next time they should buy something that they know before or so on. And so it's very interesting to see how community itself and also kind of, really helps each other. And that there's certain cultures, pieces of culture coming up that are very different than what you've seen. Another thing what we've seen is, for example, these chat groups popping up around earnings calls. And that's an interesting dynamic because you basically have people who might be more experienced to understand the different metrics being shared on that earnings call. And they can actually explain it to the other people in the group for who might this be the first earnings call they ever participated in. And so again, where, community is really basically a mode here to help educate each other, but to also kind of, help to have an eye on each other and kind of, add an extra layer of protection to a sense. Because at the end of the day, like one thing that we truly believe is the sense of that in the same way, like a diversified portfolio is kind of considered less risky, that, a diverse culture around the stock market can actually build stronger financial literacy to people. That's it.
Thank you three for those riveting and informative conversations. We appreciate Alisha Bhagat, Kaya Thomas, and Leif Abraham for sharing their insight. And thank you for sharing your day with us. If you like this video, subscribe to WorkLife's YouTube channel for more digital events. Check you later, my friend.